Hey, I'm Adrian.
And this is Craig.
And you are listening to Cash Talk. You can find us on Instagram at @TheAdrianHall, at Financial Fowler and Cash Talk Podcast, or you can email us at cashtalkpodcast@gmail.com. And now for the stuff that we have to say in every episode so we don't get sued. Thanks! Discussions in this show should not be construed as specific recommendations or investment advice. Always consult with your investment professional before making important investment decisions.
Registered representative securities offered through Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer, member FINRA, SIPC, investment advisor representative, Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge, Movement Mortgage, and Cash Talk are not affiliated.
Movement Mortgage supports equal housing opportunities. NMLS number 39179. Adrian Hall, NMLS number 1752332. NMLSconsumeraccess.org.
The pandemic that we've been living through here in the past year, we've obviously got some interesting situations coming up and popping up all over the country and in the housing market. And specifically in East Tennessee, the housing market is bonkers. And part of that is due to the fact that, well, people can't legally be evicted. And there is, a nice forgiveness on mortgage payments right now if you can't make those. So the supply of houses is very low right now. And we may be seeing a horizon ahead of us that's going to put some people in some tough situations that we want to help you think about. So let's just start with a little bit of a hypothetical case study here and say we've got a, middle-class family purchases a house. Let's say the value as of today is $170,000. And this was their first house they bought. As their family grew, they moved out and purchased a second home and continued to rent out their first house. And they've gotten into the pandemic, and their renters, their tenants, stopped being able to make the rent payments. Well,
yeah, and to be fair, they don't give you notice they're going to stop. I mean, sometimes you get a nice tenant that says, hey, I just lost my job. I got laid off. They've closed due to the pandemic. But a lot of times you find out because the first comes by and the fifth goes by and the 10th goes by and nothing shows up.
Right. So, regardless of why it may be, the payments stop coming in and you're reaching out to your tenants, trying to figure out what's going on so you can at least be aware of the situation, not hearing anything. Then you finally let's say you finally do get a hold of them. They're very apologetic. It's not like they want to be missing the rent payments. And you feel conviction about trying to work something out with them and know that you can't legally evict them anyways. That's fine. So you start helping them out. You start making sure that the mortgage payment is still getting paid and your budget and cash flow starts getting really tight because now you're covering 2 mortgage payments and not receiving any rent. Okay. And so you stop making the mortgage payment on your rental because you can do that right now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's look ahead to the future when the forgiveness on these types of things is going to go away. What if you realize that you're not going to be able to get back into good standing and be able to afford this situation? What can you do to right these wrongs here and get back in good standing? And I don't know if there's one good answer or multiple good answers, but that was just kind of a little bit of a hypothetical that we can use to set the stage for, okay, some people may be getting into some uncomfortable situations coming up. How can we help people think through that?
So to preface one thing that you mentioned, if you're a landlord in any way, shape, or form, you probably know this. If you're not, you may not. But in the state of Tennessee, every state's different. So, check your laws. But here we have every state has a lot of protections regarding tenants and landlords anyway. But just because your tenant misses rent doesn't mean you have legal ground to kick them out immediately. There's a whole process it must go through. You have to notify, then you go to court and file proceedings. And then if they don't do this and that, then they get evicted. with the COVID epidemic or pandemic, that entire process is federally frozen. So if your tenant stops making rent payments, you cannot just go evict them. Now, if your lease comes to an end and you decide not to renew, okay, great. If you all work out some kind of agreement and you're like, hey, how about this? You just move out on the first and you won't have to worry about paying any back rent, and I'll just get my house back and I can find somebody that will pay. That's great too. But if you want the formal process, you can't do that. And it sounds easy to say you'll just ask them to move out. But if somebody is living their life and suddenly their income comes to an end and they can't afford a roof over their head, where are they going to go? They can't afford, rent somewhere else, security deposit somewhere else. And they likely know they're going to have to stay put. They need to stay put. It is a very complex issue. Moral of the story. It's not this black and white, here's your answer. It's very complex. It's growing, it's changing, and it's different person by person. So,
good point.
Yeah. In this situation, the tricky thing here is okay, so let's say your tenant stops paying you and you do take advantage of mortgage forbearance and you put your mortgage into deferment. It's usually only 3 months at a time. And some banks and credit unions are more lenient and they'll let you just keep deferring it. Others will stop it and say you have to go in for 3 months and then either catch up all your payments, or maybe they'll put them on the end of the loan and then you can do it again, or maybe you can't do it at all. Basically, the regulation was, yes, this is a thing, and nobody said how to do it. So everybody's doing it differently. But more of the story, if you were let's talk it out for a little bit. If you were the owner of the house in that situation, Craig, what would you do? Let's say you had enough savings, and keep in mind the savings was not put aside to cover the house being vacant. The savings was put aside to put your daughter into the hospital if she broke her arm. And now that money has to go towards paying this mortgage payment. Let's say you have enough for 2 months. What would your mind go to next? What would you do next?
Well, I think, first of all, let me preface this by saying that although I'm in the financial industry, I have never yet been a homeowner. So I am speaking totally from a non-experienced perspective. And I've never been a landlord. I've never rented any homes out to anyone. I've always been a renter ever since I've moved out of my own when I was back in, 18 years old. And there are some, there's a lot that goes into why that has been the path that I took. But ultimately, anything that I, speak about with renting and mortgages are not from personal experience. So I can say that, from knowing myself, I would try to, make that payment and try not to defer. But at the same time, I would also be thinking about the fact that, hey, I do have these savings here for a reason, and I do not want to be put in a spot where I need some cash and then don't have it for something like you said, going to the doctor or something like that. So I feel like that would be a very stressful situation, but I guess I would do whatever I could to try to increase my income. And if that wasn't possible, I would look into selling the house. I think that's the route that I would take.
Yeah, I will also preface, I have rental properties. I've owned homes. I currently own a house. I've not been in this exact situation, but anybody who I think had just a little bit of panic in April 2020 thought about it. And so one of the things that I thought at the time was, okay, I had one house rent. I have two now, but at the time I had one house that was rented out. What if they stopped paying rent? I knew when the pandemic hit and the first waves happened, I realized I was secure. My paycheck wasn't going to stop. I realized that my husband's paycheck wasn't going to stop. So we knew our bills were going to be covered, but we didn't budget in paying for this other mortgage for more than a couple months if the house goes vacant in between people. We couldn't support it for 9 months straight. That's not written in the budget anywhere. So we had a conversation on, okay, what would we do? Would we be lenient with them? Would we try to like force them to get some payment coming in, even if it's anything? How long could we keep the house covered? How long, like, I mean, keeping in mind too, although there's been some legal black and white on utilities, but if you're not paying your rent, you're probably not paying your utilities either. Like, you got to pick and choose or do bits and pieces of each. So there's lots of questions that come up. But one important thing too with selling the house, which is a logical thing, if you have equity in it, it's a lot more difficult to sell a home with a tenant in it than it is if the house is vacant. And so I was asking myself in April, like, okay, if things truly hit the fan, I knew we had X amount of money until we were out. I think it was like, okay, I think we calculated for all of our houses, and then including our income coming to zero, if like everything went to just straight zero on the income level, I think we had 8 months of pay to cover everything, and then suddenly we'd be in that spot. And keeping in mind, at month 8, your account's hitting zero, so it's not like you reach that point and then now you can start to think about what happens next. So we kind of figured, okay, if it came to that route, we could probably ride it out to the end of our lease. And once that lease is reaching, the final month, we give them a 30-day notice and say, hey, you're out. Like, we can't renew it. And honestly, I'll be black and white. I don't even know if you can legally do that. Like, I know in a normal world you can opt to not renew for whatever reason you want. But if they have a COVID related issue, I don't actually know. I've not got that far. But I have the ability to go that long. I did. Most people are not me. So I'm not sure, and that's the tricky thing. Is like, on one hand, I don't want it to be tenants versus landlords. I'm not trying to come off that way. On one hand, the majority of landlords in the United States don't own more than 2 houses, period. Like, I don't know the exact number, but when you picture a landlord, you picture like the game Monopoly, where like your cousin owns all the properties and you just have your little thimble going around paying $200 and everything you go. That's not the case for a lot of people. Most people are honestly just getting by. I have a couple of houses, which I do a little more for profit than I do because I couldn't sell. But I know a lot of people who they bought a house and maybe they're not upside down, or maybe they're barely upside down. Like, a common thing, they bought a house and then they got divorced and you've not created any equity to even sell it yet. Or you bought a house, you weren't expecting to have kids and now you do. Or you had children and then your family dynamic changed and maybe people were leaving and now you got this big old house and you don't have, like, you can't keep up with it. So you choose to rent it out and just kind of at least break even until you can sell it. So you're not making any money. And then the person says, all right, cool, I can't pay you any more rent. So now you couldn't keep up with the house and it's back on top of you again. Like, it's complex. But on the reverse side too, from the tenant side, you need housing. Like, you need somewhere to live, you need somewhere to stay. Most people, it's so easy, I think, to look down on the poor and kind of say, well, you could just get a higher paying job. You could just get out here and hustle and find something. Record unemployment is like, so many people are losing their jobs and they can't just go find one. And if they do find one, they're earning substantially less than they did before. And it's not because of their poor decisions. It's because their job is no longer available because of a pandemic. So it's complex. I don't know if I have a black and white answer, but my initial reaction very much was try to stomach it, but keep my exit strategy like plan A the whole time. Like, don't just say I'm going to ride it out until the last possible minute, because an example is like, I bought a house that was in foreclosure in 2020. And once you start missing your mortgage payments, not, deferred, but like you've actually now just not paid it, it gets substantially more difficult to catch back up. They, like, the banks and lenders will work with you, but there's a lot of laws on that. Like, for instance, if you're 4 months in foreclosure and they have filings, they're about to send you to court and kick you out, and you make a payment and a teller somewhere just posts it, that can reset the whole foreclosure clock. So usually, talking from like the teller side of things, if somebody was in that situation, there was notes like all of their account, do not accept any payments, do not this, do not that, forward them to so-and-so, because it's so black and white. But I guess to summarize this whole little rant I just went on, I'd communicate. I'd honestly just look at all your options, lay them all out on the table, and honestly write out, like, if we're still here on April 1st, we're doing this option. If we're here on May 1st, we're doing that option. And unless things change, you have to hold on it, because if nothing else, part of financial education is knowing when to protect yourself and when to, guard yourself. And that's one of those important ways where, like, even if it means trying to sell the house at least break even or even a slight loss, it's better than taking a 5 or 6 figure foreclosure on your record that follows you around for 7 years.
Right. And so here's something that I think we can do. Let's consider the variables here for someone to consider in the situation. So let's talk about, like, today. The supply of houses is very, very low. And if your house is in the $150,000 to $250,000 range and you put it on the market, it's going to sell so fast.
Yeah, as long as it's not hot, bubbling garbage. It can be warm garbage, but as long as it's not hot garbage, it will sell quickly at this moment.
Right. So let's say you are at the end of your clock, right? And you are at the point where you have to do something, make a change, because the situation you're in is not sustainable. I think that deciding to go ahead and list your house and sell it, even if you have a tenant in there, it may be a good route. What is involved in selling a house that has a tenant living there?
First question I had. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering with, like, the notices to the tenant. I know that technically they're still on a lease, so you have to work out a deal with the buyers about, so I don't know really what's involved, but I know as the owner of the house, you still can sell the house even if there's tenants in there. And that may become a little more difficult, but when you're in a market like we are now, it may make it a little more feasible to go ahead and think about selling. And if the situation you're in is not sustainable and your options are to irreparably damage your own financial picture or situation or sell a house that you are stressing over, might as well sell the house, right? So let's talk about that. What does someone have to do in that situation if they are a small-time landlord, owns maybe 2 or 3 houses, and they're in a situation where they really have to get rid of one, and they're in a hot market like we are now? What's involved there?
So one tricky spot that people are kind of falling in now that we've been, like, through the pandemic a year, which should have been just a couple weeks anyway, anywho. Now that we're here, you can, if you have a tenant in your house and you're the owner of the house and you want to sell the house, you can legally sell the house 100%. But in the state of Tennessee, the lease follows, like, what's the word? It supersedes the sale. So just because somebody buys the house does not mean that now it's under new owners, under new management, you got 30 days to move out. It doesn't work that way. If the lease is up in September and you buy the house in May, guess what? You have to wait till September, and then you can 100% not renew it at that time and kick them out. Totally. But that's where it gets a little gray, because I think if I, planned myself accordingly and calculated myself accordingly, I could buy a house like that, of like, okay, the tenant is in here and we've already established that they're not paying, and let's just expect they're not going to pay at any point. They just can't. So you're buying this house where from day one you will earn nothing on, and you will pay for it to sit there, for other people to live in there for as many months as it takes for the lease to end. You also have to think about when things like that happen, the tenant usually picks up on the vibe that they're about to leave and they stop caring. So you're not going to get maintenance requests. You may even get vandalism and damage. You don't know what you're going to walk into. Everybody's situation is different. Um, it's tricky because a lot of one of the economic issues that's going on with the housing shortage is there's not enough houses. That's literally what it means. There's more buyers than there are houses. It's common for any house to get multiple offers at this moment. A lot of people are in socioeconomic decline, so they can't afford to buy, or they can't afford to sell because they can't afford to go to the next place, and they're just barely making it by where they are now. Or maybe they are in a good financial spot, but it's very common where if you are thinking about selling and you feel unsure about the world, or maybe you have autoimmune diseases or things like that, and you don't want to risk lots of strangers coming into your house and getting everything, touching every surface, every light switch, every counter. That's why a lot of people aren't moving also. There's so many complex things here, but putting up the house for sale, it's on one hand, it's a really good idea because you need to do something. And I say, if you have a situation like that where your lease isn't up for 6 more months, you should get it up for sale if you reach that date. But it's going to be difficult for a lot of buyers to take on the house because, let's think about it. If you're earning $60,000 a year and you're paying rent somewhere and you've decided, you know what, this is my year. I'm going to buy a house this year and it's going to be great. And then you go and you find a house and you fall in love with it and all the things. And then when you go to make your offer, you find out that, yeah, the people who live there are tenants, which you knew because you had a schedule with the tenants to see it, but you didn't know that they're not moving out for 5 more months. And you didn't know that they've also not been paying for the last 3 months, and they probably won't pay for the next 5 months. You're probably still going to have to pay rent wherever you are. And that's assuming you didn't time it up where, your lease is ending and you're buying a house. If you even have the option to keep paying rent wherever you are, and you're going to be paying mortgage on this new house and property taxes and homeowners insurance and homeowners association dues if it's in one. So you could be out thousands of dollars just to get the house. And so a lot of people will flinch or even flat out walk away. I have the ability to wait, but let's be honest, instant gratification, I don't know if I would. If it was a house I was going to live in, I may be well, I really like that house, but I don't want to wait 5 months for them to move out and then I have to go fix everything and then move in. I'll just find something else. Right.
So what I'm hearing is that's not feasible. So what is feasible is to say, okay, I cannot continue to sustain this situation. I'm going to go ahead and communicate with my tenants. Hey, just so you know, this is your notice. As soon as the rent forgiveness and the mortgage forbearance and deferments and all that ends, I'm putting this house on the market. And if you cannot start making your payments, you will be evicted. At that point, you have the courts on your side and you can get the person out of the house, list it, put it on the market, and get rid of it that way. If you've decided that you cannot continue to sustain the management of that property. And what's saving you right now is the fact that we are in a pandemic and there are options for deferring mortgage payments and, there's some rent forgiveness as well. So ultimately, that is the point of those regulations, is so that people don't get thrown out on the street. And so as the landlord, you're protected as well. It just might mean that you have to communicate with the tenant and say, hey, when this all ends, you either got to start making up these missed payments or I'm going to have to start eviction proceedings and my plan is to sell this house. At that point, you can have a plan together. You can pull a team of, a realtor together to help you sell it, and maybe an attorney if you need help making sure that the proceedings with the eviction are taken care of. But long story short is, it takes a lot of planning, and it's definitely not something that you can just, do on a whim. I guess the moral of the story again also is real estate investing is not an easy or low risk venture. You got to really know what you're doing when you're getting into this.
Yeah, it's just like stocks. One other thing that is a reality I want to touch on, I have run into many people where we talk to doom and gloom of, all right, everybody lost their jobs and everybody's going bankrupt. There's a lot of inverse happening where you've been fortunate. You are renting, but you've been incredibly fortunate. You've not had any lapse in pay. You've paid your rent on time. Business as usual in your house, and it's great. But the value of houses are going up. And let's look at it two ways. Let's say option A, the landlord has recognized his or her house is worth way more than they bought it for, and they're ready to sell and cash out. Or option B, let's say that they were a landlord who, they lived in this house. They were basically upside down on it. So they rented it out. And now they're not, because values have gone up. And so now they want to go ahead and move on to the next adventure in their life and get this one from under them. But you as the tenant, you're sitting there in your house, and then you get a notice saying, hey, your lease is coming up to an end, and we all knew that. But funny story, do you want to buy this house? Oh, you don't want to buy this house? Okay, great. Or maybe you can't buy this house because you're not quite ready or financially there, or that this isn't your forever location. Great. Well, we're still going to sell the house. So consider this a 30-day notice. What would you do if, in 5 days, for an example, you hit the first of the month and your landlord reached out with that proposition? What would you do?
That's a good question. Reframe that for me. Ask me that again.
Yeah. So let's say you've been the current place that you rent right now, because you mentioned that you don't own a house. Yeah. In your present life, you are kind of growing your career, and that career might take you out of the area you live in now. And you also know that you're planning to buy. These are things that you want to accomplish in the future. You're focusing on that. And then your landlord calls you in 30 days and says, hey, I've decided to sell the house in the next month. So if you don't want to buy this house, then I'm going to be putting it up for sale, Craig. Have a great day. Bye.
Gotcha.
And obviously it's a railroad to your life. So what would you do then? Because a lot of people are going through that.
Gotcha. Sorry. Okay, I follow you now. Ultimately, I would not buy the house that I'm renting right now. No question. I would not. Yeah, no. That's the first very quick answer is thanks for the offer, landlord, but no. Not buying that house. It's not worth it. And let me give you some information on why that is a thing. I am currently renting a house where the rent is just outrageously inexpensive. It's very, very cheap. And that is because the house is not a nice house. But I'm a frugal guy, and I have just stayed there because I cannot, get behind the idea of increasing my housing expenses. So that's really what it is. I live in a house that is really not a nice house at all, and the rent is very cheap, and I would not buy it if it came down to it. But that would put me in a position where I now do not have the time to be picky about the house that I want to purchase or build a house. My timeline shortens a lot in that scenario. And I really would have to, probably try to get into purchasing a house as quick as I can. And that comes back to why it's important to take care of your credit and make sure you're always working on reducing your debt exposure. So that's what I've been doing for years, working on my credit, making sure that I don't have too much debt out there. And so I'm in a position where if I needed to move quickly and get a mortgage and buy a house, I could do that. But right now my priority is finding a house that I really like and being picky about location and, the amount of land and things like that. So I am going to take my time and continue to rent this place as long as I can, until I, have a good situation that I feel confident in, where I buy a house or build a house. And so, to answer your question, if my landlord came to me and said, I'm selling this house, you can buy it or not, but you're going to have to move out, I would just have to say, okay. And my purchasing timeline might change, or I may just start renting somewhere else. I'd have to venture a guess that I probably wouldn't want to rent again. I probably would just change my strategy with my first home purchase, and go ahead and just buy something a little quicker. So that's probably what I would do.
I get that. I'm also finding a lot of people like they get shocked by it. And so then they reach out to me, the mortgage lender, and like, hey, I want to buy a house. I have to be out in 3 weeks. And I'm like, well, unless you already found the house, you're kind of tight there, buddy, because you need room to like find the house, inspection, appraisal, all that stuff. But that's one thing I've run into. Something else I've been seeing also, which is real, is they like, let's just say you're not in a place you can buy. You just simply cannot buy. But now you have to leave and you'll get your security deposit back. Like usually, let's say you took care of the house, so you'll get that back, not a problem. But to move, now you have to come up with a U-Haul or a moving truck or something. You're going to have to come up with first month's rent, security deposit somewhere else. You know, those are all paid in advance before you leave your current house and get yours refunded. Anything else that goes on, utility connections, like there is a very sudden cost that you get slapped with, to be totally honest, because you only get a 30-day notice that this is what's happening, because that's usually what's required by law. If your landlord gives you more, they're being generous. But that's another complex thing about this current housing crisis. Like it's so easy to look at the numbers and say, oh, well, houses are up so much and this is so great. It's great if you're a homeowner sometimes, but I'm finding over and over people who are not at that spot, they just keep getting stuck. And I don't know if there's ever a good solution. I mean, sometimes I feel like the good solution is just sitting down and being pragmatic about your situation and not making any rash decisions. Like don't jump into a mortgage because you got to buy something and then you buy a house that you absolutely hate. But at the same time, don't like freak out. Or I think that the big thing I'll say, because I've seen it, is don't just ignore it. Don't just say, okay, well, he told me I got 30 days, but if I can't find anything in that 30 days, then I don't know. We'll just figure it out some other way, because he or she does not have to sign that lease again. And then what's your plan? You're going to be out and have nowhere to go. So I guess I don't know what the correct answer is, but that is this whole situation in general. To keep it like, 30,000 feet in the air, is there's just so many variables and so many different situations and problems that there's just no quick way to fix any of it other than to recognize where you are now could change, whether it is homeownership, whether it is employment, whether it's renting, anything. Your situation could change and you can't predict the future, but you should always do what you can to make sure that you can absorb whatever type of change gets thrown at you, no matter how big or small, because you can't predict it right now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty much, there's a lot of complexity to this stuff. Ultimately, it's a complex issue. Housing always has been, especially during a pandemic. So it's definitely something that should not be taken lightly. It's definitely something where if you get that 30-day notice as a tenant that your landlord's going to be selling the house and whatever. Obviously, I don't know if that can really happen right now during a pandemic, but let's just say we're in a normal times. Yeah, you can't dilly-dally about that. You got to quickly find your options, figure out where you're going to move, if you're going to rent, start the, mortgage approval process if you think you're going to buy. It's definitely no time to sit back and wait on things to develop. So I think it's just about taking, proactive steps, about being objective about what you want to do with your finances. And that takes practice. But as you continue to do that over time, you get better at it. And it kind of bleeds into every other part of your life. So I think people are doing the right thing and working in the right directions and working on the right things. So just keep it up, right? That's all I can say.
Just keep surviving.